regime and pluralism. He was here a few yards away from the place where we are now, and again a human bomb has eradicated him, and he is no longer with us. Before, with my friends who accompanied me, I wanted to go to the place where his name is inscribed at the door of the cafeteria, and I am still very emotional as I speak to you tonight. I am very happy to speak at this Hebrew University of Jerusalem, this city who means so much to me, which means so much to me. You mentioned this text that I had forgotten. I was not familiar with the text of Levinas that Benny quoted of before, and in the same way I had forgotten this obituary, this humoristic obituary that I had written, and I'm not really so fond of, but I find today that I was saying there that a great part of my life would be spent here in Jerusalem, and it is true that in fiction, at least in my self-fiction, it is true that I thought about Satan, but it is true that since my first book I have always imagined myself living and being attracted by the light, the beauty, and the spirit of this city where I cannot forget either, and I cannot forget it, this city and this university, which have produced a great philosopher of the previous century who is very dear to both Benny and myself, and I'm thinking about Jean-Paul Sartre, of course, the only the only award which he received was here at the university, where he received his honorary doctorate at this university, and this man who was really breaking his head and his mind trying to contradict every philosophical thought that evolved in his mind, and he was found as meriting the doctorate, the honorary doctorate of this university, and that is one more reason why I feel emotional about being here this evening and speaking to you here under these auspices. I'm happy to do that as well under the auspices of the Center of Research of Anti-Semitism, the International Center for the Research of Anti-Semitism, and also under the auspices of the Center for Levinas Studies, because I hold him very dear in my heart. This institute that we founded 2 years ago, Benny and Alain Fickelkraut and myself, under the auspices of the name of Emmanuel Levinas, who, in my view, I had said that here in Jerusalem on the day of the creation of this institute, the name of Levinas, which to me embodies the encounter between non-religious Judaism and religious Judaism, secular and religious Judaism, the Judaism of diaspora and that of Zionism. The name of Levinas, for whom Judaism is the brother of Europe, and for whom, inversely, the attempt to annihilate in Europe and by Europe, to annihilate Judaism, of everything that was embodied in the Jewish question, which brought to an immediate divorce between Judaism and Europe. The name of Levinas embodies all that, personifies all that. His various inroads into Judaism, and perhaps the very core of this contradiction that I live, this contradiction that we live as a tie, as a knot, something that we have to think about, to reflect upon, to work on. But I'm happy that the name of Levinas this evening, tonight, is echoing here on the occasion of this conference and this conversation. And I'm also happy, finally, that this is all taking place in French. I'm not sure that, I'm quite sure that you're not all French speakers. There are all those who are also in an adjacent room with whom we will communicate later on by video. But I am happy that French is the main vehicle of this evening. Israel has many friends in France, many more than one would tend to think. They are much more numerous than it would seem. But it is true that in the last few years in France, in certain circles of public opinion, an ill wind is brewing towards Israel and the Jews. This ill wind that I was alluding to in the text that Benny mentioned, where I said, halte à la diabolisation, stop this satanization of Israel. True, it happens that I feel very pained by what happens in France when I read, not all the media, but certain newspapers, certain editors, and I feel the pain of Israel more than ever estranged from the other nations. Israel plunging in a great solitude, steeping in a great solitude. And I'm happy that what we have to say to each other tonight is said in French, in that particular language, in Jerusalem, in French, in Jerusalem. Daniel Pearl. All begins, this strange adventure, the adventure of this book began a little more than a year ago, about 15 months ago. I found myself at the very end of the world, in Afghanistan, in Kabul, in the office of the president, Hamid Karzai, the man who followed the Taliban, who succeeded the Taliban, and brings in a more moderate Islam. And I believe that he is at war with the Islam of the fanatics, of the so-called God-inspired, crazed people, and there are many names for them. One can guess that the 41 victims, that among the 41 victims of yesterday's attack in Casablanca, there were some moderate Muslims who refused to give in to the fury of these crazed persons in Sarajevo, in Bosnia, a city that I became quite acquainted with, and I spent some time of my life, a period of my life. There were Muslims who felt very much their belonging to Islam, but did not interpret it as a command to kill, but on the contrary, and very clearly so, to quote Levinas again, as an interdiction, a ban on killing. With my friend Gilles Herzog, who's here, I remember that one evening we heard the president of Bosnia explaining that because he was a believer, because he was a reader of the Quran, because he was a Muslim, he would not accept to do to the Serbs, to the fanatics of the time who were the Serbs, to do to them what they were doing to others. It is because I am a man of faith, said he, that I would never burn their mosque. So I found myself in the office of President Karzai, who was surrounded by some of his ministers, and he had convened them, invited them to receive me together with him, honoring old ties that I'd had with some of them, some of these ministers who were companions of Massoud, of the commander Massoud that I had been acquainted with in the past. And so all of a sudden, somebody brings in a message. Karzai became very pale, said a few words to his 2 or 3 ministers who were with him, and then he turned to us and said in English, "The American journalist Daniel Pearl, we have just learned that he's lost, that he's been murdered. He's been assassinated." I left Kabul a few days later. I went through Pakistan. I stopped in Pakistan for a few days. And I was just loitering around the mosques, who were supposed to be the very sanctuaries of the Pakistani fanaticists. And I was offered all kinds of objects of propaganda, cassettes, etc. And one day, they sold me an enigmatic cassette. And I did not fully understand at the time what it contained. And I bought it, and I looked at it, I watched it, and it was the video testimony of the humiliation, the suffering, and the beheading of Daniel Pearl. In the seconds that followed, in the minutes that followed, this image of the young Jew, this image, more exactly, this idea of a group of fanatics with a camera filming the spectacle of this young Jew saying, "My father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish, I am a Jew," and then showing this cassette at the door of the mosque, making it into a trophy, a propaganda object to prove the existence and the horrid greatness, so to speak, of their God, at least the image that they have of him. And I had the feeling immediately that I was facing a very significant event. I had the feeling that an era had begun, in my spirit at least, with the death of Commandant Massoud, this Islamic leader that I mentioned before, and then a few days later, or shortly after that, the destruction of the Twin Towers, September 11, and again, so to speak, with the terrorists basing themselves, so to speak, on the teachings of the Quran, or what they were deriving of it, and here, as a third sound of the gong announcing this new era, was this murder of the journalist. And I decided to devote the time that would be necessary to understand who was this boy, this young American Jew, with this saying, with this strange face, without actually revealing the image of a man who thinks he's going to die very soon, without reflecting any humiliation. This young man who just said, "My father is a Jew, my mother is a Jew, I am a Jew." Who was this young man? What did he do? What did he think? And I resolved to devote whatever time it would take to come to know him, to better understand who were his assassins. Who were they really? Who were leading them? And what were the reasons for this murder? It does not happen every day, that a Jew is beheaded in the 21st century, that this beheading is filmed and this cassette is being distributed in mosques and everywhere, and on the internet, etc. And I decided to go to the very deep of this affair and to investigate it. So in order to sum up, I will probably go more into the details later on. I think we'll devote to that about 1/2 of the time. And I shall attempt to answer questions as well. But to sum up, I'd like to say that I have discovered in the course of that year many things. If I were to put together, to assemble the lessons of this very strange year that I spent in the skin of a dead man, in the mind of a dead man, and God knows that I think I'm more apt to be a happy man than to be morbid. But I spent this year in the mind, in the head of this person. I spent this year also within the head of his assassins. I tried to understand what happened there in the mind of a man who decides one day to organize a conspiracy to mobilize people, to in fact mobilize a small army with this one aim of committing this horrible crime. So if I were to sum up in a very concise manner the lessons of this investigation, I would say the following. First lesson of this investigation, which for me is most important, is, and in the very heart of the debate on the war in Iraq, at the time where the entire planet had its eye fixed on this part of the world, and especially on the regime of Saddam Hussein, the first lesson, or perhaps the first fact that became evident to me, that has been sort of persecuting me throughout this year and almost blinding me with its lucidity, is that the real scene is somewhere else. The whole world is talking to us about Iraq. The forces of the free world believe, and they were right, think about the emergency or the urgency of toppling down this dictator, and that is self-understood. But finally, the more I progressed in this work, it transpired that the real sanctuary of world terrorism, the site where the suicide thoughts of that as we see them expressed today, where they are being fomented actually for many years, is not that dictatorship in Iraq, but rather this other part of the world, more to the east, somewhere between Pakistan and Afghanistan, a kind of a transposition of the center of gravity of this Muslim world in its most fanatic part, in its most worrying part of the Islamic world. That is the first lesson that became very much apparent to me. This did not lead me to take a stand against the war against Iraq. I despise what became to be known as the European pacifism, which is really a source of many problems since the time of before World War. So I did not express any opposition to this war, but as I went along with this investigation, I had the feeling of a mistaken perspective and a certain blindness to the real source of the worst. A second lesson which I drew from this trip into the land of evil is that if it is true that Daniel Pearl was kidnapped for sure and probably assassinated because he was Jewish, he was certainly kidnapped because he was Jewish. He was assassinated. Whether he was assassinated because he was a Jew, that is another question. I'll come back to that later. But if that is true, we must add and say that he died as a victim of an anti-Semitism which has, in this arena at that moment, had assumed its new face, its new appearance. And I'm speaking under the auspices of both the Institute for Levinas Studies and the International Center for the Research of Anti-Semitism, for the study of anti-Semitism. As you know, anti-Semitism has a history, and this history has several stages. And there was a time where the strongest tendency in anti-Semitism that managed to raise the masses was the Christian tendency, and mostly the Catholic one. For a long time, the Jews were victimized and were the victims of pogroms because they were ascribed the murder of Christ. They were attributed the murder of Christ, the murder of God. And as you know, this anti-Semitism was gradually replaced by another trend of anti-Semitism, gradually covered by another trend, which claimed exactly the opposite, that anti-Semitism that stemmed off the period of Enlightenment. Let's say that it evolved under the shadow of the great luminaries, the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire and others, who reproached to the Jews not to have killed Jesus, but rather to have invented it, to have produced it. There is a whole history of anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitic trend whose main message is that not the people who killed God, but the people who invented God, who invented monotheism, who brought to the world this very harsh law that Levinas speaks about in that passage or fragment that Bernard-Henri Lévy quoted before. There were other trends in anti-Semitism. For instance, an anti-Semitism which was perhaps very different, even if it recycled some of the elements, and that was the biological, racist anti-Semitism that claimed that the Jews were the incarnation and representatives of a race that brought in venom into the race of paradise, so the war of the origins, hell versus paradise, the double choice, etc. But taken in a very, very, very narrow, stupidly narrow interpretation, with the slogans pertaining thereto. And we can feel for quite some time that this anti-Semitism is returning in our very days, but with a different slant, perhaps. They are now inventing a slightly different trend, which is based on different procedures of legitimization, other modalities or types of reasoning, and very, very generally, they are opposing Israel and the issue of victimization and connecting it to the Palestinian issue. We can feel it coming for several years already. They say you are not the representatives of a bad race. You are not perhaps the killers of Jesus, but you are certainly the modern executioners, and even more perverse than in the past, because in order to better cover your crimes, to have people forget them, you even invent for yourself imaginary crimes, so to speak, perpetrated against yourselves, and that would hide like an ink stain would hide your own crimes. This mixture of Israel's sacralization of the victim, the Palestinian victim, and of course this discourse, of course, not taking into account the real suffering, the concrete politics of a given government in Israel or elsewhere. So this discourse is the discourse which is trying to re-engineer something which today allows, as in the past, to put fire in the hearts of people, men and women, and give them the feeling that it is possible and it is right and correct to hate the Jew as a Jew per se. So the death of Daniel Pearl and the way in which it is described in words, in which it is justified, in which the Pakistani officials that I met all along this investigation, and even the simple people, quite often, not always, but quite often, the simple people in Pakistan experience it today, all that confirms what I said. Daniel Pearl died because he was apprehended, and I quote the Pakistani press, including the obituaries that they published, because he was a friend of Israel, because he was a Zionist agent, because he was an accomplice of the crimes of Sharon, because he was a Jew in the sense of modern anti-Semitism. So for me, this affair has actually finished crystallizing and clarifying without any shadow of a doubt that new system that we are facing today, that new approach that we are facing today, that we have to face today, whether we are Jews from here or from elsewhere, whether we are Jews who think one way or another way. This is the very heart, the very core of the new engine of anti-Semitism today, of modern anti-Semitism today.
Now the third lesson of this investigation, while it's true that the Pearl affair indicates what I referred to earlier, this decentralizing with the Jew being identified with the very name of Israel, Well, from this we must really conclude that this affair breaks out, erupts, is given voice in a part of the world. Well, you could imagine it happening in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, anywhere generally in the Arab world, in some part of the world which doesn't have any specific actual experienced contact either with Israel or with the contact with actual Jewish flesh, as it were. And in this novel I relate sometimes, somewhat humorously, how Pearl died in a part of the world where the name Lévy, my own name, doesn't mean anything to anyone. It's no indication at all of what it means, specifically and explicitly. When I arrived in Karachi the first time, the taxi driver came to the airport and he ran into a policeman in a not very nice part of town. I had to get out of the car. The policeman took my money, my passport, and when he saw my name, he saluted. He was very respectful, and I thought, my goodness, I must have found the only philo-Semitic Pakistani. No. I suddenly started remembering that Lévy is the name of an elite police battalion that's responsible for matters on the border with Afghanistan, and it was a name given by the British back in 1850s. So as far as they're concerned, I apparently have connections with an elite Pakistani police unit. So you can see how the Jewish reality and experience is utterly foreign to that part of the world in terms of what it means and its significance, its links with Israel and so on. It's utterly foreign and alien to that part of the world where anti-Semitism is so deep-rooted that it can produce the scene that triggered my book, The Beheading of Daniel Pearl. Now that's very important because clearly this combination, this encounter of a really ferocious form of anti-Semitism with souls which don't have the slightest idea of what it means to be Jewish, not the slightest memory, not the slightest experience of an encounter with the Jewish earth, with the Jewish body. That's quite amazing, and it's something that we find utterly difficult to grasp because it's something that in France, in Europe, in the United States is hashed over time and time again by the media, this whole concept of Jewish and anti-Semitism and so on. There's this idea that peace should come about here, that the Israelis and the Palestinians should somehow make peace, that there should be a dying down of the fires of war here, so that peace will be made here, so that world peace will be established, so that the Islamists can fall back into ranks. That the main fuel of the radical Islamic wave that is sweeping the world should be really grounded, anchored in the situation here, which is something which is going on forever with so many fanaticisms. But that argument just totally breaks down and is utterly blown up when you find out that at that very place where this fanaticism is at its most passionate, they find they have absolutely no concept of Jewish bodies, Jewish names, or Jewish anything. Now that very argument can be seen to have its truth, to have its origins, to have its discursive genealogy, if I can put it that way. And that's basically the equivalent of an argument, which here you're very familiar with. And I was talking about just earlier with Simon Epstein, That's the argument of Louis Ferdinand de Céline in the 30s, when Céline wrote L'école des cadavres, le Baudra, Bagatelle pour un massacre, 36, 38, 41. These three anti-Semitic pamphlets that were so virulent. They were just as virulent, including they were just as virulent as the pamphlets of the Islamists, saying, when people say, well, if only the Israelis were to agree to peace, then Islamic passions would be calmed. But he says the same things in the 30s. He said that it's because the Jews have been intransigent, it's their identity, their very being. They are the people who are responsible for everything that's going on. They are the very heart of this war that is coming, or then of the war that has broken out. With this lengthy experience with Pakistan, this going into the lion's den, all of my experience there proves that as well. This political and geopolitical lesson, which is just as blinding as that which I referred to at the beginning of my presentation. And then my fourth lesson, and perhaps this is the main one. I was interested in Daniel Pearl, but I also was interested in those who murdered him, his murderers, one by one. I wanted to identify them. I wanted to track them down. I wanted to understand the path that had led them to become what they had become and do what they did. I wanted to understand how their minds work, their mindset, because of psychological aspects, and also this whole question of power balance and the war and democracies. The democracies, including Israel, are involved in a war, not a war of civilizations, but a war, political war with radical Islam in all its versions. So I went and tried, well, there are others as well, many journalists who've done this work. Let's say I'm one of the few people who've taken some time in order to go and look at the backdrop from the other side, looking in their heads, through their heads and through their hands at how the satanic dimension is currently being played out. In other words, what is called Al-Qaeda. Now, there are very concrete lessons and there are very specific results and outcomes of this investigation. For example, I think Daniel Pearl was about to show that Al-Qaeda is not bin Laden, or rather that the question or the question which is often asked by the journalists and the other powers, is bin Laden alive or not? Is he living in Afghanistan or where? That's not really a particularly valid question, because, you know, bin Laden could only have come out of the way in which the BRP is presented, above all as the spokesman of a certain number of tutors and mentors and masters, political masters, perhaps spiritual masters also, I don't know. Oh, far more important than him, one of whom was identified by Daniel Pearl. I managed to track him down as well. He's called Gilani, and he is perhaps one of the reasons why he was killed. Pearl discovered, and I subsequently discovered this as well. There's the stage. There are the people who get the prompters. Bin Laden may be good at strategy, so he's not a good reader of the Quran. He's not a brilliant leader. That is the task of people far more important than him, whom certainly still alive, this Gilani, Isha Galini. He's in Lahore in a house that I saw. He teaches at a madrasa, and I went in there in Karachi. It's called the Binori Town Madrasa. So this is a far more complex picture than the world videos would seem to indicate to us. Now, when it comes to faith and this question of the spiritual aspects of this affair, the holy warriors, as they call them themselves, these holy warriors of this holy war. As a result of my investigation, I'm absolutely convinced that the religious dimension in radical Islam is far less important than is believed, certainly among those who are in charge, the bosses. If I take Omar Sheikh, one of the main people in my book, and I reconstruct his itinerary, and I break it down into different periods, like military periods, my conclusion, and in fact I'm absolutely convinced of this, certain, I'm familiar with his past, his intellectual and spiritual background, I'm sure that the religious concern is definitely the least of his worries. As far as all of these people are concerned, they have a taste for power, for money. Let's just say their libido for dominance is far, far greater than their intellectual longings or their desire to defend Quran values. Certainly the case of Omar Sheikh. Elsewhere in my investigation, not so much in Karachi as in Dubai, I was very struck by a really mafia-like aspect of Al-Qaeda. Often it's said, and I think this is one of the reasons for the major prestige enjoyed throughout world opinion by Al-Qaeda among Arab audiences. They say there is supposed to be ascetics, and they say that Bin Laden has given up his fortune and handed it over for the revolution. I believe it's total opposite. Al-Qaeda, I believe, is an enormous worldwide network for extortion and mafia based on trafficking in drugs and in girls, particularly virgins. It's like an Islamic tax system, an income tax levied on the poor. It's not a system that does good to the poor. Rather, it's a worldwide, a global system of extortion. Looked at from the other side of the scenery, the backdrop, Al-Qaeda's image, satanic, horrible, diabolical, but with a spotlight on it, making it look as if it's sacred. When you look at it from the other side, it just dissipates, and you can see that these are gangsters charging around in their four-wheel drives, large numbers of women, wives, perhaps women, violent acts carried out by them, with so many people who are taken in by them, who are credulous and abused and exploited. I also discover, this has been said in part, but I go a little further along this path. I show, for example, how the people who surround the bosses of this Islamic international, which functions like the old-fashioned international with a central party, and which has brother parties with aspects of territoriality, where Karachi could perhaps be a new version of a kind of Moscow in the new version of the international. I show them, as I was saying, how these individuals, these personalities, far from being poor individuals coming from madrasas, obscurantists, illiterate, trained by the Maulana, who themselves are illiterate. No, they are the most sophisticated offshoots of Western education. Omar Sheikh, for example, went to London School of Economics, LSE, came from a very good family, well-off family, and again that disproves the thesis according to which this revolution is a reaction to despair, people who had nothing and had nothing to lose and therefore throw themselves into the struggle. It's not at all like that. Omar Sheikh comes from a very affluent, educated family. He himself is a very sophisticated financial expert, utterly proficient in manipulating the most modern financial instruments, and I have proof in particular that some of the attacks of the 11th of September were financed by very daring operations on the World Stock Exchange, anticipating the drop in markets that would inevitably result from the destruction of the Twin Towers in 9/11. So basically this means not only delving into the head of a man who had been killed, but also delving into the mind of a man who is still very much alive, these people who manufacture kamikaze agents, suicide or homicide killers. Like many Europeans, undoubtedly, perhaps like many Israelis also, I don't know, my image was somewhat simplistic of an inspired suicide bomber, someone who decides one morning to put on his explosive belt and go and blow himself up a couple of 100 meters away from here, or not really out of despair but out of faith would blow himself up. I discovered that they were kamikaze factories, real incubators of suicide bombers in Pakistan. First of all, they inculcate people with political education. There's a whole kind of market and economy for all of this. For example, in Dubai, I saw kind of agencies, if you like, which act as intermediaries between the exchange office and the insurance office. They change addresses, they set up shop for a certain time, a few days, a few weeks, and then they move on. And at those points you see a son or a daughter come along, or the parents come along to negotiate the joining of this army of suicide bombers by their son or daughter. Real negotiations involving means or resources that could establish a butcher shop in Karachi. Someone has a life policy that he's prepared to make over. Real negotiations and a proper market is a supply and demand set up. And it's a real economy of death. Obviously there is something of a dimension of madness. It's a modern form of mania, not one that says if God is dead then everything is allowed. Rather it says because God is there everything is allowed. This is an economy, a very down-to-earth one. It doesn't involve anything sacred. It's utterly sordid. And this is the other face of these people, of these politicians who are responsible for these crimes. And then, of course, there's the actual individual, Daniel Pearl himself, and his character, his personality. He's the main figure in this book. And really, he lived within me throughout this investigation. And to some extent, this book, as I think I've already said in my tale, this book is a little bit like a paper tombstone, a tombstone in words for this posthumous friend, Daniel Pearl. It's a tomb for someone who didn't have a real tomb, a real grave. His body was cut into 10 and stuffed into plastic bags. His remains were dug up a few weeks after he had been so cruelly and horribly killed. So I tried to make him a little paper grave in my own way, as best I could. So let's now turn to Daniel Pearl. I tried to understand why he was killed, who he was, and I came across this scene referred to by Benny in his introduction. This dreadful scene, and it's a scene also which is so enigmatic when he was forced to say, my father is a Jew, my mother is a Jew, I am a Jew. And this is really one of those points where the book really posed a question mark, where it hesitated. And this hesitation is something that I allowed to remain in the book. I didn't erase it subsequently. There were 2 points really in reading this sequence, this image. There are 2 phases, if you like. There's the first phase where, like everybody, I thought that Daniel Pearl's murderers forced him to say these words before killing him in order to humiliate him. I am a Jew means, they meant, in their mind, to them it meant, and hence it meant really placing these words in the mouth of the person that they were torturing. It meant that they were humiliating him as if they were forcing him to say, I am a subhuman. And that, I thought, originally was what was meant by these people who were so horrible to him before slitting his throat as if he was a cow or a pig. That was the first reading, the initial reading, that I think practically everybody produced. And then a few months later, I met Daniel Pearl's parents. I went to Los Angeles to meet them, just as I went and met Omar's parents, as I went and met the friends of both of these individuals, and I went to meet Daniel Pearl's parents. They were Israeli Americans, utterly admirable. They were so dignified and so brave. In a way, they were broken by an unending mourning, a kind of bloodletting of pain that would go on until their own days come to an end. And at the same time, they were driven by this desire to perpetuate the memory of their son, and at the same time the values that he represented, for which they thought he had died. And they said, no, you haven't understood a thing. Reread what our son said and declared. Look at that video again, that video that we didn't want to see. No parent in the world could look on at such an awful scene of their own child being murdered in that awful fashion. But it's as if we've seen it, we can imagine it. And I myself actually would have told them. But they said, look at it again, look at that video again. And that's a sentence. There's a sentence which should surprise you. And they said, which one? They said the earlier one. Before he said, my father's a Jew, my mother's a Jew, I'm a Jew. Before that he said, I belong to a family of Zionists. My great-grandfather, Chaim Pearl, gave his name to a little street in a little town close to Tel Aviv called Bnei Brak. And Daniel Pearl's parents said, Pakistan's a long way from Israel. Bnei Brak isn't exactly Israel's biggest town. And it's a very small street in Bnei Brak, that street. And there's no way that the barbarians, the fools, the idiots, the illiterate people who killed our son could have known that. If Daniel Pearl, if our son said that, whereas they didn't know this, it's because he wanted to say this. He was telling them. And in that way, he was really, it was his intention to make a statement, an affirmation. And if you listen to that message that he is sending out to his captors and to those who will see the video and to us, his parents, who would hear it one day, if you hear this message, what he's saying is, I belong to a family which built this beautiful thing, which is Israel. I have a grandfather who built towns. You are barbarians, and you are wicked men, and I and my family, while you were preparing all this barbarianism, they were making civilization. And his parents said, that's what he was saying, this whole sequence, this affirmation of the name of a Jew, this sanctification of the name, this Kiddush Hashem, it's not a confession that was wrung out of him, that was forced on him. It's something that he said in pride, he said it proudly, as something to glory in. And listening to what they said, I indeed did think of those heroes in some of the novels of Isaac Bashevis Singer, who, when those carrying out pogroms made them admit to their Jewishness in the same way they did it proudly, these characters in Isaac Babel's story. Same reflexes, same approach. We affirm in glory that which people think we would consider to be an insult. This letter, such a strange letter that I commented on a few years ago in a text that I gave to the Monde, that strange letter from a Nazi soldier sent to the Eastern Front in 1943, whose unit in the villages that they went through had a great time rounding up the Jews, the men, the rabbis and the men, and cutting off their beards and making them take their clothes off and that, and then hanging them and photographing them, or having themselves photographed in front of these Jews who were hung up, these Jews whose beards had been cut off and sometimes whose faces had been disfigured. And this German went through all of these towns in Germany, and in 43 you saw these German soldiers posing next to these humiliated rabbis, and they would send these photos of them off to their family as a kind of postcard, holiday postcard. And it was such a strange, there was a strange, enigmatic anecdote. There was a Jew in one of these Polish villages who started to sing as he was being forced to admit before he was killed that he was a pig of a Jew, an old Jew who wasn't worth anything, was worthless. He started to sing, and in this Remsmar exhibition, named after the person who'd collected all of this, there was a letter there among all the exhibits. This letter came from, or was written by a soldier who thought the whole, this image of a Jew who was starting to sing when he was forced to say what he was. He found it highly comical, this soldier, and I must say that it was seen of the same type that those who tortured Daniel Pearl were really experiencing, that as they tortured him, this he became far more subtle than his murderers. Not only more subtle, but at that very moment he gloried in what they thought they were forcing him to accept as an insult, in this affirmation of Jewish being, in giving such positive aspects to Judaism. He gloried in it. He said that this was something he was utterly proud of, and this was something that impressed me very deeply. And it's one of the reasons which makes Daniel Pearl such a wonderful and striking embodiment of Jewish values.
Just a few more words before we start our dialogue, our conversation. If I still have a few minutes, the parents of Daniel Pearl, Yehuda and Ruth Pearl, believe, and I believe with them, that this Jewish being imposes a certain set of values and duties on those who claim that they want to maintain the memory of Daniel Pearl alive. So what are these values that Daniel Pearl believed in and was loyal to? And I would like at the end of my book to be seen as being loyal to them as well. What are these values, put more concretely and not in an ethereal manner of general ideas? There is a certain foundation which was established, named after Daniel Pearl, which explains and studies those values that have to do with you as well, that bear on you as well. The Pearl parents and his relatives and friends insist on what they called the necessity for a dialogue. But dialogue doesn't really mean a lot. It is a kind of word or term which can push us back into those more shapeless general ideas. But I think that they think that Daniel Pearl believed that this war of this cultural war that everybody talks about is not inevitable. And the protagonists of this drama, Daniel Pearl and Omar Sheikh, his assassin, read at the same time the Huntington book about the clash of civilizations. Omar reads it to study the logic of future times, the description of the world at war that he would like to bring about. And Daniel Pearl reads the same book in order to refuse those very same ideas, to refute them, in order to say that this thesis is groundless, that it does not describe real war or real divergences of opinion that the world will have to face. Daniel Pearl believed, for instance, and it is an idea that I hold very close to my own heart, that the only war of civilizations that is valid is the one that opposes democrats and totalitarians, for instance. That is the war of civilizations, the war that manifests itself within the world of Islam, between those crazed fanatics and those who would like to apply the values of democracy and tolerance. The values that Daniel Pearl believed in are probably also here in this part of the world the values of negotiations, the values of compromise, the necessity to escape an encounter that is a murderous one, Of course, I'm not attempting to make the dead speak, especially not this particular dead. But I think I know enough about him to assert that he had this desire, this ardent desire until the very end, until the moment before his execution, to understand what was going on in the head of his opponent, to try to achieve a compromise with this enemy, not compromising on principles and what your own essence. I am a Jew, a Zionist, my family has founded that city of Bnei Brak, but a compromise that renders existence possible, that renders cohabitation possible. And I believe that here in Israel, at this point in time, it is really a message that echoes very significantly. And I think that from the very first day of the Second Intifada, I revolted against the satanization of Israel. I opposed this abject kind of judgment of this country and these people, but I also said that I did not believe that the military solution is the real or the only answer to the problem. And I said, and I was quoting a Greek historian, that there is no people or a state or an army that is strong enough to be sure that it will always remain the strongest. And I believe that modern wars have taught us that there is a tremendous strength of the weak, that there is a power, a great power in the show of the victimization, that there were victories that were horrible, be they military or political, that were in fact the defeat and not a victory. And that is why I many times spoke in Israel, and I advocated in Israel whenever I had the occasion to speak. I advocated not dialogue in its abstract sense, but not only for reconciliation and an idyllic reality between adversaries, but for political daring, a political approach which is perceived, which understands that victory can be temporary and strives to attain real victory, not an imaginary one. And I believe that this is what Daniel Pearl could think, or what his memory could evoke in our minds. Thank you very much. Thank you for this remarkable lecture. I am sure that many in this room, everyone in this hall, could appreciate the talent of the journalist who's conducting a very serious investigation, the talent of the author who is a master of the word, of a colorful language that can take us into the very heart of the subject, as well as the depth of the philosopher who can understand the links and the ties between these various parts. Bernard-Henri Lévy has very kindly consented to enter a conversation with this with the audience in this room, and we'll try to take time for questions and answers. There are two microphones on the right-hand side and left-hand side of the hall, and I believe that for good order's sake, people who have a question to ask, would they please step over to the microphone? And this is also being filmed, and it would be easier for us to listen to them. And while you are thinking about this richness of thoughts that were exposed to you, I will ask two small questions myself, which really troubled me when I read the book and while I was listening to your lecture. A question that you touched upon the issue of anti-Semitism, but I'm asking myself, in this trip that you took into the end of night in Pakistan, when you think about a country, a state, which is not an Arab state, a country where there are no Jews, a country which is far away from our Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one meets there such an anti-Semitism, such a ferocious hatred of Jews. There is a scene in the book where you speak with the head of the chief of the police, and he really goes on, and he says at a certain moment, "I do hope, Mr. Lévy, that you're not Jewish." And I'm very curious to know what you really felt, because you did step out alive. How can we explain such an abstraction with the Muslims of Pakistan? And the second thing, which is so well described in the book, very precisely, and it is very worrying for Israel, among others, from the point of view of security. Well, it is a nuclear power, the only one which is a Muslim country that has the atomic bomb, that has nuclear weapons. Should we here in Israel, should we be worried? Because they practically never speak about Pakistan here. They speak about Iran, they speak about the Arab countries. But for security services, for the political elite, is there a real danger here? As far as Pakistan is concerned, this is what I said in the beginning. Yes, I do believe there is a blindness of the West and the reality of that threat, among others the United States. Everything happens as if they live by a definition of rogue countries that goes back 20 years ago. The famous trio, Iraq, Iran, and Libya, of the Carter era or the Senior Bush era. Now we have another trio, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. And I believe that there is a change of perspective that should be carried out immediately, urgently, if we really want to fully appreciate and understand and learn how to react to what is happening to us, among other things about nuclear weapons. And this is the conclusion of my book. This was certainly one of the investigations that Daniel Pearl was working on. In other words, the transmission by certain security services of Pakistan of nuclear elements to Al-Qaeda. The last article for which that he did not write, and one of the reasons why I had to write this book, which is in a way the writing of this interrupted article in order to 500 pages in order to complete the last investigation of Pearl. That was it, the investigation about the Pakistani researchers and scientists who are really of world renown, who are inveterate Muslims and members of the Jihad and Al-Qaeda, and they nurture the dream to transmit their knowledge, their science, and some of the products of this science to people who are close to bin Laden. Pearl had detected that, had traced the trip of two of them, Bashir bin Mahmoud and Abdul Qadir Khan, two important scientists to Kabul and Kandahar. I here went a little bit beyond the point where Pearl had stopped, which confirmed not that Al-Qaeda has the bomb, that would be ridiculous, not that Al-Qaeda is about to have it. I believe that it is still a long time before that happens, but that this is their dream, that this is really the dream of some Pakistani scientists, and that some of the security services of that country are accomplices. There's no doubt about that. That was the conclusion of Pearl, and that is mine as well. About the anti-Semitism without Jews and without a concrete experience of Israel or the Jews in Pakistan, well, that will surprise only those who believe that anti-Semitism has anything to do with us, that anti-Semitism has anything to do with the Jews, but anti-Semitism has nothing to do with the real Jews, with concrete Jews. It has to do with something else. It has to do with an imaginary with metaphorical structures, with all kind of satanic interpretations which are very foreign to us, and which do not reflect what we are at all. So I would say the opposite. I would say that this Pakistani anti-Semitism, a little bit like Austrian anti-Semitism in Europe. I said a few months ago that there was a public opinion poll in the Austrian press that showed that the European country in which there is the largest number of people who believe that there are too many Jews, that they're seen too much, is the country where there are the smallest number of Jews after the World War, which is Austria. So that confirms what I always thought, that anti-Semitism is something that has to do with anti-Semites, but has nothing to do with what the Jews really are and what they can produce in the concrete and real world. So this Pakistani story, this delirium of this commissar who really practically vomited all this anti-Semitism harangue on me, which really caused me to really feel sick. And when he said at the end, I hope you're not Jewish, Mr. Lévy, and I said, well, I don't think that you're a real Muslim, because the real Muslims know the book and know that the Jews are something else altogether. So that really is anti-Semitism, pure and simple. A question that's not asked into a microphone is not heard by the interpreters. Would you please ask that person to walk over to the microphone and ask their question to the microphone so we can hear them and translate them? There is a microphone, and Mr. Bernard-Henri Lévy couldn't hear himself either. I believe that we need both. Facing hatred, we do need both. I believe that when faced with hatred, with that kind of hatred, if I understood you correctly, we need to fight against it, we need to oppose it with equal violence, but I believe that we will never be sufficiently strong to be sure that we will always be the strongest, and hence we must create the conditions for to enable us not to have to carry out war all the time. I believe that there was no other means in the beginning of the Intifada. I believe there was certainly no other means to do faced with those suicide bombers and this war declared by the Palestinian leadership against Israel. There was no other means but to respond in a military manner. But I believe that once the military response was given, the only way to go about it is by providing also a political answer. And a political answer means that there is a sovereign gesture, a sovereign measure taken by he who today is yet, for how long I don't know, but I hope that for many years to come, who is still the strongest, a sovereign gesture towards the opponent, toward the enemy. I really and truly believe that. I feel that very deeply. I believe that if we speak about this part of the world, the situation in which we are, in which Israel is really an impasse, is a dead end, and I'm sure you feel that as well. The alternative, that has been said hundreds of times, it's almost trivial or trite to say that, but a country that would admit within it Palestinians from the territories will no longer be a Jewish state, and a state that would like to remain a Jewish state must deny them citizenship, which is of course unthinkable and contrary to the democratic reality of this country. So there is a dead end, and we must somehow come out of this impasse. And we can only do that by political means and not only by military means, even if the military answer was at some point necessary.
I want to make a very brief comment and then ask a question. Listening to you, we really shudder. You referred to, you followed in Daniel Pearl's footsteps. You followed the same path, and you did manage, nevertheless, to escape. Otherwise, the witty obituary that was read out might have come true. Now, you referred to those who are crazed by God, and you referred to the mafia. I'm sure you don't think this, but it gives the impression as if everything is in the sidelines. It looks as if there is a healthy Muslim world, certainly a moderate one, where there are a number of mafia-type groups, various interest groups, which are rather sordid and are trying to manipulate all of this in order to trigger and generate or unleash some sort of war against the West, exploit it and so on. You referred to the various modes of anti-Semitism. Don't you think you perhaps skipped over the very crux of everything here? That is to say, Islamic anti-Semitism. Now, I don't have problems with Muslims. You were born in Algeria, I was born in Morocco. I respect them, but there is a certain Muslim basis of anti-Semitism in these schools of the Quran. If the politicians that you met are sometimes moderate and Western oriented, nevertheless in these schools of the Quran, they are what determine the current Islamic approach and philosophy, which is unfortunately fanatical. Don't you think, therefore, in the very essence of the body of the Muslims today, we're facing a form of thought which is utterly coherent and solidly based, which for them makes utter sense because they're opposed to us. They may consider us part of the West. The West and Israel, I think, do not understand that this is the very nub of the problem, though. Don't you agree with me? Bernard, before you reply, I'd just like to repeat my question. I think that you referred to Bernard-Henri Lévy referred to this situation in Pakistan. But don't you think what happened to Daniel Pearl isn't really referring to something that's quite impossible, something that you cannot actually put in symbolic terms? That's my question. Well, that's a very difficult question to deal with this evening. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I can, in the shortness of time available, respond to it. It's true that that does really bring us to the crux of matters, but I really don't want to skip over this in replying. The other question is obviously a difficult one as well, but perhaps it's a simpler one to reply to, at least briefly. Yes, of course you're right. Obviously, there are the three things, the three aspects. There's the foolishness of the illiterate, there's the mafia reality of the gangsters, and then there is a Quranic source also. Yes, of course, quite right. And the Quranic source of anti-Semitism, of fundamentalism generally, and of all the subsequent barbarian acts, are very much linked with the essence in the Quran. To put this very succinctly, it's a question of debt. Everything in the Quran which claims to eliminate the debt at the point of previous writings, everything in the Quran which argues as if that letter is the first one, that nothing came before it, that the beginning is the Quran and everything else, i.e. the Bible and the Gospels, but above all the Bible, is only at best a vague outline, a draft, which is now being replaced by real writings. All of that obviously triggers such phobias to what came before, hatred and jealousy, a desire to wipe out that which came before, and therefore a murderous desire. That's all quite clear. And everything involved here conspires along the lines of thinking, together with what and combines with what I said about the mafia and so on. But having said all of that, the question is whether the Quran, whether the readers of the Quran will indefinitely leave it at that letter of their own letters. Won't there be desires to interpret, to elaborate on? Don't you think something will happen in the interpretation of the Quran? And I think that is the case. And we do indeed know that, albeit in a very minority fashion, underground, almost clandestinely, there are efforts being undertaken to produce a rereading of the Quranic text in order to recognize the debt. In other words, along the lines of acknowledging the prior existence and nature of the text of the Gospels and above all of the Bible. And that really is the nub of the question. The day that the Muslims, as a majority, agree that they are not the first, that they do not, that they are not the sole holders of a perfect epistle that came out of nowhere, an imaginary body, when that day comes, if it ever comes, then their question of their relationship with Christianity and above all the Jews will be posed in utterly different terms. When I said there is an alternative to fundamentalism in Islam, that's what I was thinking about. And I'm thinking here of the work of a certain number of scholars and academics who, one is more or less, depending, familiar with, but who are working. And maybe this one will take 50 years, another one will take 20 years. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But this is a theological question, and it certainly is a very valid point with regard to this issue of the debt owed by Islam to the religions which came before it. Bernard-Henri Lévy, a little to the left. First of all, welcome home. That's the first thing that you should have been told. I want to refer you to anti-Semitism here. I want to talk about anti-Semitism. We said, first of all, there was religious anti-Semitism, and then all the forms of anti-Semitism that we've suffered and experienced. What could we, as Jews, have done for centuries and centuries in order to fight against this anti-Semitism? When a child is born, it's not an anti-Semite. Perhaps we have forgotten how to make ourselves known, to communicate in order to state and convince people that that anti-Semitism is not something that has any validity. That's my first question. I don't think it's a question of communication. I think one can defend oneself against anti-Semitism. One can fight anti-Semites, one can strengthen oneself against attacks by anti-Semites, but one can certainly not convince them, nor can one, through tools of good communication, make them drop their attacks. I think it would be to deceive ourselves to say that. And one last question. I'd like to come back to Europe. I was visiting an English friend who's very concerned by Israel's isolation in Europe. Isolation which has come about and will come about in even greater form. You referred to Israel's friends in France, but what can one do, perhaps, so that those of us who are perhaps Israel's ambassadors, who have the good fortune to be Israel's ambassadors, what can we do to combat this isolation? And what, in your opinion, is the state of play? How are things? Is it really bad? What do you think is going to happen in the future? Thank you. So your question is what? Israel's isolation? Yes, says the questioner. One sees a lot of people who are really concerned by this isolation. I'm speaking of a Jew who's living perhaps in England or in France, who starts talking to other people. And it's so difficult for them to explain Israel's position. Well, perhaps hands-on advice for these people. Well, I think you have to give me advice. You know, there's a book that's just come out in France, written by a very strange individual who I think is a little odd. Well, I'm not going to criticize him here now, he's not here. Called, Is It Still Allowed to Criticize Israel? This book has just come out. Is it still allowed to criticize Israel? As if there was a kind of terror, reign of terror, forbidding any criticism being directed at Israel and leveled against its policy. He says this question is constantly asked, and that's why he's called his book by this title. Now, everyone criticizes Israel. Everyone does it all the time. The question is it still permitted or allowed to defend Israel in France and in Europe? This often places you at a major disadvantage. You become the target of criticism. You become a kind of neo-fascist figure. That's what happens when you defend Israel. People say, you are a murderer. That's the trickiest thing. Well, how to do this? I don't have any advice to give you, I'm afraid. Well, let's say sometimes it happens, well, more in Israel than in France, in fact. But I also say that Israel's policy, it seems to me, can be open to criticism. That's not the subject of this evening's discussion, so I won't label the point, but it seems to me that this is also legitimate. And the responsibility of a Jewish intellectual is also to make arguments and make points where he thinks there are things that are not right in the policy of the current Israeli government, but to defend Israel in its very existence and its legitimacy and its right to exist. This is something which, in a blood-curdling fashion almost, becomes terribly difficult to argue for in Europe. Not just in France, there are other countries in Europe where it's even more complicated, where the very idea, or the dominant idea, is that this is an artificial country by a historical oddity and something that shouldn't exist. That's an argument which is presented by many people to plead for Israel, to explain that Israel, for example, as I had recently to do in Italy, to explain that Israel is not only the heir of the Holocaust of the Shoah, because Israel's enemies, adversaries and foes wish, in the best of circumstances, are prepared in the best of circumstances to agree that Israel is legitimate, as long as one just sets it within or against the backdrop of the Holocaust and its consequences. To say that that isn't what Israel is, to say that Israel to some extent existed before, that its roots go back far further than that it's not just a kind of consolation prize or a refuge for people that have been martyred. People don't understand that if you're saying more than that. And I'm afraid I don't have any greater advice to give you than that, and I think that probably leads to the end of our discussion. Or one last question, perhaps. I'd like to ask, if I could, on this side of the auditorium. We have two speakers, one with a microphone that's off, who's asking a question, and one with a microphone that's on, who's been silenced. I'm sorry. The interpreters cannot interpret because they can't hear the question. Now we have another question. I'd like to ask a question about the book. Okay, last question, and that really will be the end. Well, my question concerns political use of anti-Semitism. You've referred to anti-Semitism as a construction of the mind used for political ends. That's how I understand what you said previously. Could you illustrate the place of anti-Semitism in its political use relative to the use of other feelings, such as anti-Western feeling or the Muslim faith? How does anti-Semitism fit into all of this vagueness of things that are used for political purposes? Well, briefly, and then we'll have to break up because we have to give back the room. Anti-Semitism isn't to be set there. Rather, I think it sets its own course in all these traps of evil and everything that is happening now. Anti-Semitism is not an element that is added to aspects of discourse which could come out of it, which unfortunately are integrated. Rather, I think it's something very essential as a real founding element in the various neo-isms in Europe, in the various fundamentalisms there, and also in part of the Arab world. It's absolutely essential. It's a essence, the nucleus, if you like, where all these other isms are kind of branches. I think you shouldn't present it as an additional element, but rather as the very seed of evil when talking about anti-Semitism. As to this English minister, well, that was a private comment he made talking about Kabul and so on, absolutely dreadful comment that he made, and it was, I should imagine, immediately denied and rejected, and I'm sure that it reflects part of, in part, a lack of awareness of what's going on in France. Not entirely, however. I know that sometimes I certainly do disagree, my goodness, with the French government, but I don't think that one can say that the essence of its attitude vis-à-vis Israel is to be found in anti-Semitism, hatred and so on. I don't think it would be right to say that. The French government is like French public opinion. Sometimes you have to pull its ears. Sometimes you have to make it fall into line. Sometimes you have to say that it's walking the wrong way, it's not following the right sort of path. And journalists and so on are fully aware of that sometimes, and sometimes they lead it, or they may not do it the greatest service. There certainly is a very pro-Arab approach, but there is also a genuine friendship to be found for Israel, and there's a clash between these two trends always going on. It's not just now, and that's what we have to tackle. And then there are private comments made by individuals in positions of power and so on. But that was an English minister you were quoting, I believe, not a French one. Oh, was it a French one? Well, you know, there are ambassadors of fools as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bernard-Henri Lévy, thank you. Thank you very much.